Program 3 continues on the issue of the authority theme with a focus on grading and making what I call the demand for work. This is not unusual because the first few classes of the semester, the authority theme, a relationship between the instructor and the students, is usually a major issue that needs to be dealt with. We also explore the differences and similarities between teaching and therapy and the importance of making a demand for work. I try hard to help these faculty members, many of whom have been practitioners themselves, understand just how much they already know about teaching if they will take what they have learned and apply it to the class group and take the skills they've developed and apply it to their new role as a teacher in an educational enterprise. I present an example of one of my own classes that illustrates how students may communicate through indirect means. The example involves a student every week eating his lunch in class and doing it loudly. Another participant then opens up another theme dealing with personal disclosure when she tells of a use of her example in a class that described the concept she called permission between members of a group to use with each other what might be otherwise derogatory terms. In this case, the term is faggot. A conflict of opinion emerges in this session on the appropriateness of the use of the term and even the concept of permission. Other examples shared in this session help to develop a framework for trying to understand when is a personal disclosure of any kind by the instructor helpful and appropriate within boundaries, enhancing the learning, and when it is not. And it's about 25 students, and a lot of them are part-timers, and they didn't have a real part-time program. So if you took classes and you were working full-time, it was difficult. And I have this one male student who comes in and is eating, but not just eating loudly. You know, in a room where somebody's eating loudly? Right, eating loudly. And I pass it over to first, because, I didn't say anything, and I pass it over the second time, and finally the third time, and I didn't deal with it in class. Now that I think of it, I probably should have at the beginning. The third time, I finally caught him over break, and I said, not only are you eating in the class, you're eating loudly. And it's a practice class. And the guy says to me, this is the only time I can eat. I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm a full-time worker. I only have one day. I start classes at 8, and I end at 4, and I have no lunch break. I said, so that's why you're eating in the class, and that's why you're eating so loudly. I said, can we talk about that in the class? He said, yes. He goes back in. Turns out half the class is feeling totally stressed, and need a discussion about how they're trying to manage their courses, their field work, their jobs. So this guy was sending a signal. And a couple of students complained to me about it. That's why I finally raised it with him. But he was actually sending a signal of the stress that the students in the class were under. And I hadn't even realized it. A little bit like you guys sending a signal tonight. People not showing up.
They're coming, they're straggling in.
They're straggling, but this is a very stressful time. At this particular time. If you're teaching, you got papers that you're reading, and there's also papers you're writing, and I think this is always the time. For those of you who've been around in the last couple of years, this month, the rubber hits the road.
So you're raising a good point, because then the question is raised of how much time do we take away when the concept is they're there to learn, but we obviously don't want to ignore how they're feeling. And I said a couple times to my students today, I'm very concerned about how you're feeling. You can see it on their faces.
Yes.
But at the same time,
we have work to do.
You don't want students to go away thinking, well, what did I learn today? So they had a full class.
I think it's actually an interesting issue because the way it's being posed is that it's deal with these emotions and feelings, which takes time away from the content, or deal with the content. Now, what if that's not a real dichotomy? In other words, what if you don't address what's going on emotionally, you're not going to get the content through anyway. Right. That people are just not going to hear it. I don't think any of you, Bonnie, were you there at that lecture on emotions and learning? No, you weren't. I know it was there. Sharon was there. They just had a lecture from a person who's done, a retired professor, a woman who's done physiological studies on emotion and learning. And she presented her slides and the stuff, and my God, it was really striking about the capacity for people to learn. For example, they had a lecture that went for 90 minutes, and the volunteer students were wired They had a device that they could really check the brain waves. And you could see the brainwave activity starting high at about 60 minutes into the class. It's going down and down and down. And then something comes up that has an emotional impact or that really hits people, and she's right up.
Oh, wow.
And then she's doing research on memory. How much do people actually remember? And what the research was showing was that there was a connection between what people were feeling and their emotions and their capacity not only to hear but to understand and to remember. I thought, wow, this is a great, it was a lunch presentation given by the Center for Learning here and teaching here on a Friday, I think it was. It was not last Friday, but maybe the Friday before. I was fascinated by it because it showed to me a biological and physiological connection between what I have sensed, as a teacher about the importance of emotions in addressing and actually learning. So I guess the question really is, were you taking time away from the learning, or you took some time to address how stressed people are? Or were you enhancing the learning, or you took some time? Now, you spend a whole hour, or 2 hours, or 3 hours with students complaining. I mean, that's not helping them either. At that point, Kelly, you're shaking your head.
Yeah,
Why?
because I can just see how I remember being in some classes where actually as a student, there were some students who would just want to keep it going, to just kind of carry it over and push it into a couple hours when it was really easy discussion, and you just miss out on the material. So.
You remember what the class was like? Either one of your classes, like today, what was the class about again?
Family interventions.
Family interventions. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
If you want to, are there connections between the content in the class on family interventions and the issue of people feeling stressed and overwhelmed? Are there?
Oh, definitely.
What's going on in the family?
What's going on in the family? So what I think is interesting is if we look hard enough at it, we sometimes can actually find a connection. If nothing else, we're modeling good practice. We're modeling how a student of yours will go into a family. And if that stress is what they're experiencing and feeling, they would start having discussion. They would deal with what the stress was they were experiencing right now, and then they would relate that to the stress of the family, why the family was going through some stuff. So you're modeling what you did today. You didn't give anything up. You actually probably taught a better class. How's that for reframing? What was your subject, Kelly?
Actually, I was in. In thinking of another example, I was thinking of the class that Jim and we actually had. It was a PhD research seminar, and I remember it was around 9/11, and I remember it was a professor that's no longer here. She had brought in, I think, candles, and she was talking about it a little bit, but I think we all wanted to just kind of process it a little bit more, that it was just kind of cut short and just getting right back into the material. And the material was very hard, so we were like, oh no, we don't want to understand discriminant function right now. So.
Well, that is an evasion of work.
Right.
But I remember 9/11. You bring back association to me as a dean. My wife and I were over to TIAA, consultant over at the what do they call that place where you go for business stuff? At any rate, there's a building
over there.
Right. And we come out of the consultant. We're talking about eventual retirement stuff. And on the screen, they have 9/11. But I'm so involved in what happened, I'm not connecting.
No.
I get back, I get into my office, I'm sitting down, I'm ready to go on to work. And Andy Sayfield, who was the associate dean, comes running in the door. He says, "You realize what just happened?" And I had blocked it out. Literally, I had blocked it out. And I'm going to busily go around doing my dean's work, completely not recognizing that we had to meet with faculty, we had to meet with students, we had to have some discussion about how to handle it. And I look back on it and I say, how am I watching this on the screen and getting back to working as a dean and not, that was the emotions. The emotions were difficult at that moment, and it blocked me from really thinking clearly about what my job was when 9/11 hit. So I guess what we're saying is you can't ignore process, but you can't let the process become the content. You can look for connections between the process and the content. That's when some great teaching gets done, when you can see those connections between process and content. Yeah, Jim.
I wanted to take a little bit further than that.
Good.
This is something I wanted to mention. A week ago in my class, I had some students bring up some concerns about grading in a particular ongoing assignment. And basically their complaint was they felt that they should have gotten better grades than what they did. And I had other students who said, this is not a big deal. it's clear what it is. That's not a problem. And they did not go on to say, although a couple of them told me personally afterwards, is what's wrong with these people? I mean, they're dealing with their own issues. And so I have those two things going on in class. And then I'm caught in with the thing about it. Well, I wanted to be sure that I was paying attention to the process. I had one person complain that we spent too much time. We spent about half an hour going through this because and I really tried to get as many people to talk as possible in the class. And, well, that didn't happen, even though I kept asking what other people wanted. But so I had kind of like two factions. I had like 2-3 students that said, we're putting an awful lot of ourselves in this, and that should be recognized more. And a couple of other students that said, well, but he's grading exactly the way he told you that he should grade, that he was going to grade. Mm-hmm. And so I guess basically I ended it by saying, well, you make really good points, and I'll really take a look at that, and I'll take that into consideration. Like saying.
You felt like write a better paper, damn you.
Well,
right?
The thing is that the issue becomes is I tell them that one of the things that they have to do on this assignment is they have to provide some kind of example. I tell them the example can be from personal experience. It can be from an experience with a client. It can be a professional experience or an experience from another class. But it has to be an example, something experiential, because I'm trying to get them to link ideas in practice. And what's happening is there's a couple of people that are doing a lot of discussing about personal stuff. And it's accessible to the whole class because it's on Blackboard. And so what they're saying is well, if we don't get, and I don't, what the grade they get on it is only available to them. It's not something that everyone else knows about it.
The material is.
But it's because they're putting their own personal stuff in it. And basically I use the same way to grade, whether they talk about personal stuff, client stuff, or any other example.
Let me just point out that what my note from last week was that one of the topics for this week people were interested in was personal disclosure. Mm-hmm. Whether it's personal disclosure on the part of students or personal disclosure on the part of faculty.
Right.
So your example is right off target.
I thought it was really interesting that the way that you said that they divided too is the same kind of division that I was talking about when I said that the class, it seems like, a group of people like work their way away from you and other ones kind of work their way towards you. Mm-hmm. And so it's always that that taking sides kind of you're not taking sides, but the classroom is dividing and going one way or the other, and it's all. And the similar thing is that you're talking about the issue of personal stuff, like Larry pointed out, where I was talking about personal comments.
Well, you want to partialize Jim's thing because I think it gives us something to work on, and it's probably a continuation of what we started spontaneously to discuss because of the food. Mm-hmm. The food triggered something that did. Just the fact that people were eating. I had the same feeling I had that morning in the class when I had that student. It brought it back to me. Mm-hmm. It came back to me, the memory of the importance of addressing what that eating was all about because you guys were eating. Let's partialize it. Let's take a piece at a time. Piece number one. How many of you had students or been students where you get a grade and it might even be a B+, and you're shocked and upset that it wasn't an A? Because you've always gotten A's in every class. Some of those students are in that category,
yes,
right?
Some of them are.
What's that all about? And what does the instructor do? Because you're going to face that. This school particularly, you're going to face that, especially when there's grade inflation, which is a problem, which I'm trying to raise. And so many people get A's and don't understand what an A paper is all about. Yeah. What's that all about? And what's the response on the part of the instructor? How have you handled it? A student got a B+, it's a pretty good grade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's not a bad grade.
I had a student that said the B gets the degree, and tried to be accepting of that rather than striving for this A.
Certainly, I have a grading policy in my syllabus, and my grading policy says if you get an adequate answer to everything I ask you on everything in the course, you will get a B.
But
What
A is
gets you an
excellent.
Pardon me?
What gets an A?
And I tell them what gets an A. I said, what will get an A is that you include information, the readings and information that you've learned in other places besides this class, And the other piece that I tell them is that you do a better job of integrating practice experiences, personal experiences, and the theory that we talk about in the class. And that if you do those things in every assignment, and across the boards, then you'll get an A in the course.
Yeah.
And I've really put a lot of time and effort to thinking that through.
So at this point, Jim, why would you spend a half hour listening to these people whine about the fact that they didn't get an A when their papers were B+?
Well,
do I sound too tough?
Yeah, no, not at all. Because the thing is that's why I brought it up. Because I was asking myself why I was.
Why do we do that?
Okay, there were a couple things going on for me, and I can tell you this right away. First of all, whenever students bring that up, I want to be, I value the fact, and I really try and encourage them to bring up anything in class.
So you don't want to cut it off.
I don't want to cut it off.
Right.
I want to respond to everything that's brought up. Also, I didn't feel particularly threatened. I don't think that was really the issue for me, because a couple of students thought that people were attacking me, and they didn't like that. And I was kind of amused by that in a way. Because that wasn't what I felt, but what I wanted to do was to really give them a sense that I would listen to them, and that even if they were seeing things differently, that was part one. Part two was...
We all agree that when this happens in a course, it's your first assignment, and some students are complaining because they got a B+, not an A, it would probably be okay for an instructor to acknowledge there's some disappointment. Maybe your standards weren't clear, you can work to get up there, and you have future assignments. I don't think anybody in this room right now would disagree that paying some attention and acknowledgement of that. At this point, you've always got A's, you suddenly got a B+. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, Then it comes to the question of a half hour. What gets us caught in that? Because I think, I was joking, Jim, but I think you probably thought, I know you enough after a couple of years, that Jim would have felt like saying to the students, enough's enough.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's the way it works. If you want to A in the course, you better give me a pretty good paper on the next paper, if there is a next paper.
But you're teaching family therapy, right?
Right.
Well, this one is mental health and disability.
And what's your, but even mental health disability, what's your reaction, Jennifer?
Well, it's hard to stop being a therapist and be the leader sometimes, And,
what a good therapist. What would a good therapist say? I just had a wonderful presentation in my group work class of I won't identify him, but a person with white male working with African American kids, and a very strong, passionate view about racism and the issue around kids who are being referred because of acting out, violence, and stuff like that. And the whole issue was he wasn't happy with what I said at the end of the presentation last week, where I said, in the end, you still have to ask these kids to start to look at what are they going to do with their lives. They have to be accountable for their next steps. He heard that as that I was suggesting that I was asking them to take responsibility for the racism and what they had experienced that led to this. That's not what I said. So I opened it up in class. It was a really good discussion because some people took him on, and he tried to clarify his ideas. And in the end, the issue was, do you make demands on people? Do you set expectations on people? Are you helping these kids? If you don't, really recognizing all the barriers they face and all the things they've experienced. You got a group, they're there, you may feel passionately about these broader issues. What's your next step? What are the kids going to do? Do you expect these kids to start to find more adaptive rather than maladaptive ways of coping with legitimate racism? Now, I thought that was a terrific 20-minute discussion in the class. I hate telling
people that they have to go see the writing tutor.
Right.
And every semester I have at least 3 students that I have to tell that they need to see a writing tutor.
Yeah,
I actually told them, not in class specifically, but from the class 1, I started telling them about the writing tutor. Yeah. And then as the weeks go on or assignments come in, as a matter of fact, just yesterday, I asked them again, I said, who's been to the writing tutor? Because they turned in a paper to me yesterday. And a whole bunch of them raised their hand, but I've been pushing it. So I didn't have to specifically, although on some of the written assignments, I did say pay more attention to your, your writing skills, your sentence,
and the question is, what kind of grade you get?
Well, I would say the content is good, so you need to work on your writing.
And do take off
a point.
So I think the issue really... Yeah. I'm sorry, Bonnie. Go ahead.
Yeah, I took off a point.
I think that as social workers, we have to write in so many different ways.
And And
they're going to be our colleagues
Right,
in
right.
very short time.
And I've been trying to talk to them about it, but the ones that, when I just got these papers, I haven't read them yet, but nevertheless, when I do, I'm going to see now how they look, because they've only given me one actually written paper before.
It's interesting, this grading issue comes up this time of year every year.
Yeah, this is...
Because this is when we give our first assignments back to the
Yeah.
students.
But
That's
I'm
the
just
advantage
saying,
of having a weekly paper, because you get it every week, and they're not shocked.
right, but I'm just saying, is it all right? I have two questions really. Like after I read this paper now, if I specifically tell certain people you need,
Well, I mean, it depends on your own view. I know what I would write. I would write,
redo it.
you better see a tutor because your work continues at this level, you won't pass this course.
Okay.
Believe me, they will be in that office. Now, I'm writing that on the paper for two reasons. I'm also making a copy of that page, and I'm keeping it in a file.
Okay.
So that when later on, if that student continues to hand in work at that level and isn't taking any effort, and I flunk the student, I'll give the C, which in some courses, like, well, I've got that paper where I didn't have any euphemisms, folks.
What should I do?
No euphemisms. No, you'll have to do a little bit better. You know, this, that. The fact of the matter is, now, what am I teaching those students? I'm teaching those students the importance of demand for work, the issue of expectations, the importance of confrontation. You also have to give support. That's why we initiated the tutor program. We created a tutor program here at the school, and I was mean because we had to say, you can't just make a demand, but also give support. So now, that really gets people's attention, believe me. When you write on the page, this level of work will not pass the course. There's no ambiguity. On the issue of making copies, that's just been my experience, where I didn't make a copy of that page, and then later on students said they never told me, I didn't get any feedback, or I used euphemisms. For me, I think it's the best thing I can do for the student, because Bonnie's right. That student's going to graduate, they're going to be a professional, they're going to be the image of our school and nothing else.
And that's part of being a professional.
So I think what Jim really raised right at the beginning is that part of us feels that little therapist part of, but a good therapist would do the same thing. I mean, you know that. A good therapist clinician will confront the client after they've built up a fund of support.
But I think that one of the issues is this is being done in class.
Right.
Since it's particular people, I want to be very careful. If the person was talking to me about it as an individual, I probably would have handled it somewhat differently. But since it's done in a class with everyone else around, and since the assignment is available for everybody in the class to see, I'm conscious of the fact that I want to be somewhat diplomatic, that I don't want to say anything that's going to, and because people are talking about kind of personal issues.
So you can't discuss the issues, and you don't want to refer to the individual student, but wouldn't you be able at that point to say, let me redefine again how I grade? It's an academic paper. And self-disclosure of personal information as a way of doing the paper, well, it may be appropriate, sometimes not, especially if it's being online and everybody has access to it. But just the fact that you put yourself in, if it isn't academic, it doesn't get a good grade.
Right.
Period.
And actually, I did say something
that's the
similar
discussion.
to that.
That's the discussion. I'm not going to talk with the student. I'm not going to say, well, you know, I'm so sensitive about this right now. I get this critical incident analysis, and my students send it in to me, and I've been using it on email with attachments because I like track change. It's so much easier for me than trying to write so people can read. So I do all the track changes, and I send them back. I sent one student's paper back to the whole class. I did. Thank goodness it was an A. It was a great paper. And I had to send an email out to them. First of all, she took it really well, you know, and she said, don't worry about it. I don't feel badly about it. But I'm saying to myself, if I had hit that button and that had been the paper that got 20 out of 30 instead of 30 out of 30, I would have felt miserable. And I would have owed that student a real apology for circulating a paper. As it was, circulating the excellent paper turned out to be a good thing because then students who got 20s and 25s could see what it was.
I often prefer that. I will say in class, I will ask the person first, do you mind if I mention that you had a very good paper to the class? Yeah. And then if she says it's okay, he says, then I say, if you want to see what I'm looking for, look at so-and-so's
Right,
paper.
or have they presented in class for the critical incidents.
I have Just on the line of what you were talking about, and it's probably not quite the same, but I had a class a few years back where there was a couple students that were really disruptive, and they were always trying to make it seem like they had a legitimate issue, but they were really disruptive, and I'm thinking, this is high school again, I'm not believing it, and when I turned to write on the board or something, they'd be chittering in the back, and doing all of the things that are really annoying, and the rest of the class was getting really, and they'd had about enough of them too. And the one time the one girl was particularly obvious and loud, and I turned around really quickly and I said, one more word out of you, you'll be out of here, and Larry will back me up too. So,
Okay.
So anyway, yeah. So anyway, they were all really quiet for a second, and then her cohort started to say something. I said, and you too. And I didn't know where to go with that anymore. So class is over and everything's done. I never had any more problem with them. A couple years later, I got a call from the girl who was giving me the problem in the class, and she said, I've been assigned to find a leader for this organization, and I thought that everybody's kind of out of control, and we thought that maybe you could handle it. Unbelievable.
We've had some examples here. We actually had one here that's included in the paper, which we finally submitted. I finally got the paper off, the one where you folks make recommendations, but one of them was on that. And I think the commentary that I had on it was, it did sound like the students were being immature, and at this stage in their professional career, they needed a faculty member to say, shape up. That's it, they need it. But there are many times when that kind of behavior is signaling something else. And the mistake is to miss the meaning of it, such as, we're young and inexperienced, we're getting ready to graduate, we're anxious about how much we've worked. There could be a lot of reasons for that behavior that one ought to be cautious to first explore the meaning of the behavior, at least a bit. Sometimes the meaning of behavior is we're waiting for somebody, an adult, to tell us to grow up. And that's one of our functions. I've come to the conclusion as a social worker and when I teach supervision and management and as a teacher, that if I'm doing my job well, there are going to be times my students are a little angry at me.
It's like parenting.
If I'm doing my job well. If my students are never angry at me, I'm probably not doing my job well. If my students are always angry at me, I'm probably not doing my job well. So it comes with the territory. I think the younger you are, the newer you are, the more vulnerable you feel. Like, what kind of evaluation am I going to get? Am I going to be hired as an adjunct? This could affect my tenure if you're an untenured faculty member. The harder it is to do that. And I think a lot of people have said in this workshop right here, last year we had a good discussion at the end of the year, and people have said, I need to be sure the dean will back me. I need to be sure this will be seen as good teaching, even if some students complain, rather than seen as, as there's a problem with the teacher. So what about personal revelations? We're not going to skip that, folks. There's the other part of what Jim said. It started last week. Bonnie had an example. We talked about the students who reacted in a class for survivors of sexual abuse. We just opened up the conversation of what is appropriate to share, when isn't it. Jim has an assignment that maybe some students have crossed the boundaries, and started to put stuff on there that was very personal and also available to everyone. What are some of the issues here for you on this thing? Yeah, please.
Well, I'm just particularly concerned about. I'm aware of the context of classroom versus family therapy session or any kind of therapy session, and so because of that, I'm very conscious of boundaries. And even when you talked about the example of, that's one example, but also even a simple example of, gosh, this is an A paper, I'd like to show it to all my students. I felt like that today, but I feel like it's also a personal thing, even though what they were writing about, this paper wasn't really particularly personal, but just the nature of keeping it professional, keeping it in the right context of a classroom, and therefore always being conscious of, opening it up to say, how are you guys doing today? You look very tired, and that whole thing, and giving them the time to process it might cross a boundary that it might resemble some kind of clinical group or something like that. And so I'm always conscious of that. So I don't even go that far. I empathize with them, how they're doing, take a few minutes. No one really usually wants to open up and talk about it, just because it is hypothetically creating some personal divulging of.
Well, certainly the course of family therapy is going to cause some kind of transference issues. A course like this is going to cause some of that. Those courses take you right into it. Statistics might not. They might raise other issues about discomfort and anxiety. But certainly take it into it. But don't you feel that that's an opportunity for you to clarify the boundary? I mean,
do I feel like it's an opportunity to clarify the boundary?
Yeah, right at the beginning, you know.
Well, definitely. I did that in the beginning, but the thing of it is that it obviously resurfaces at times when, like I said, I look at my students and they're completely exhausted and stressed and that kind of thing, and you want to give them the time to do that. And we take a little bit, but, you know, like you were saying, they could run wild and not want to stop talking about it.
Or we can say that, oh, sorry, Marcia.
No, I mean, just to acknowledge it only takes a minute.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about going on, and I don't think anybody meant that either. Because I think we also, I saw yesterday, they all looked so pale and they all look terrible. So I said, what's going on? You know, there's no energy level, nothing. But that took 2 minutes.
Right.
You know.
And that's what I did, and that's all I felt like was appropriate because of the boundaries, and like I said, not to segue into this necessarily clinical group, which I wouldn't do, but at the same time, you could see they needed more. And I felt I said it right after the.
There for.
I know. I mean, I know, and that's a social worker me. But I said it when we came back from the break too. Oh, nobody's rejuvenated and that kind of thing. But
so maybe you're going to have a flat class.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a class where they'll do the best they can, and you try to help them get going, and they're just not able that class, but they'll still appreciate the fact that you at least paid attention to it. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't there be a connection, though? I don't know what your content was for that class, but wouldn't there be a connection between what happens when they walk into a family interview and they see the same thing?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What would you be teaching them to do there?
I know, it's true. It's true. Well,
you understand what I'm saying?
Reflect on what they observe.
Reflect on what they observe and at least acknowledge, and then try to take it into the work of the family treatment, whatever it is. So, again, content and process is often integratable, especially in a course like this. If you just think about it, boundaries here, you know, I know we could probably spend the whole 3 hours talking about how upset, but I don't think that's going to really be helpful to you. Right, at this point, I think we've got to find a way, how do we cope with that in this class at this time? You know, and how do you cope with it when you run into it when you work with a family? Because I'm sure they're going to see it as a signal at that point. I guess what I'm saying is students are often watching us. And the way they act in a class is often, especially a practice class, a way in which they're going to ask us, show us how to do it.
I have a story about that that's embarrassing, but I'll tell it anyway.
I told my, hey, would it be any more embarrassing than sending students paper out in email?
Yeah.
But I want to hear it. Okay, man.
I was teaching a course, and they were into this entitlement thing. Like, it was an advanced standing course, so they thought, because they had their BSWs, that they knew it all already, and they happened to have the same text in undergraduate school that they had in graduate school, which I felt bad about, but couldn't do much about that. That was human behavior and social environment. And
it's quite okay for them to have the same practice text in undergraduate and graduate. That's not a problem.
But they were certainly complaining about that, and I thought it was a problem myself, and I blew it. I just lost my cool. And I talked to him about, I said, you are being obnoxious. You think you're entitled? What kind of social workers are you going to make? And I went out, and all of a sudden I stopped in midstream and thought, what am I doing? You know, I'm losing it. So
maybe
they
had a discussion about whether you lost it or found it.
Well, the
funny
thing about that was, then I kind of backed off. I said, okay, I'm finished. Let's go back to what we're supposed to be doing here. And I ruminated about it all the way home and felt embarrassed and the whole thing. The next day I get a call from a colleague, and she said, I hear you lost it last night. I thought, oh my God. It's out in the community, you know.
Everyone knows.
Oh my God, everybody knows I lost it.
It's going to be on HBO.
Yeah, right. And I said, how did you know? And she said, well, I have one of my interns takes your class, and she came into work this morning, and she said, Bonnie Collins lost it last night. And knowing that she lost it, I guess I can lose it once in a while, too. Yeah. So that was an interesting.
But again, there is also
the model thing.
But there is also the issue of. I mean, that's very helpful. Students realize, and you come back and talk about it the next week. Yeah. That's excellent. But you know, did you really lose it? You know, that's an interesting question.
It felt like a loss.
My first year students did their laboratories and their videotapes, and they were bringing them in. You know, first year interventions. They got to do all those videos. and you see them trying so hard to figure out the right thing to say for the first 3 or 4 minutes, and the tapes come alive the moment when they can't think anymore about what the book says they're supposed to say, and they start to become human and spontaneous. And I think the most important thing is coming out of it is I'm trying to teach students to be a little bit more spontaneous, because so many people are telling them not to. So many are saying, don't say anything till you know what the right thing is to say. And trust yourself.
Yeah, trust your gut.
Trust your gut. So I really want the body. We're not going to spend the whole evening on it, but I'm not so sure you lost it.
Well,
Maybe
I felt like I lost it.
Well, that's, I think, what we often feel when we express some real emotion. But if you have built up a fund of caring with your students, which I know you do.
Yeah, it was into the course. It wasn't the.
You understand what I mean? It's not the first day.
Yeah.
So there's a relationship already. They saw a real bonding come through. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with Bonnie saying, come on, stop them so entitled?
So where's the difference between that and self-disclosure then?
Well, that's a form of self-disclosure.
I know.
You know, but it's not personal information self-disclosure. That was the issue that came up last week, which we're not really touching on it so far.
Are you talking about personal disclosure?
Yes,
of our own
that was raised
information?
last week. When is it appropriate for students to disclose? Jim's already telling us he's a little uncomfortable because he realizes that assignment goes on Blackboard. My hunch is Jim's going to think a little bit more about how to lay that out with them and what's appropriate and what isn't for a public assignment. Yeah. If nothing else, you have to worry about FERPA. FERPA, the protection of educational records. And if we ask students to put something that is going to be made public and they put private information on, there could be some concern about whether or not we violated the confidentiality of the students' records.
And that's why I said I wasn't sure if we can, with the student's permission still, but I don't even know if it's supported by the university to say, I'd like to take this girl's paper and copy it and give everyone a copy.
If the student agrees, it's okay.
Just ask the student.
Any student can give consent to the sharing of records. We can do that. We just had a little discussion in our meeting on the Committee on Students today. We were revising the documentation. And can 2 students sit in? We have 2 students on the committee. And the policy we take, they can sit in on the discussion if the student who's up for grabs, who's had an ethical violation or presenting a grievance against faculty, if they say yes, they can sit in. And one of the new faculty members said, but if the students are members of a committee, they're members of a committee, they should be able to sit there. And we really have to point out, FERPA is very clear. And only if a student says, I would agree that the student members can sit in, we have them in. If a student doesn't say, I get it in writing now as a chair, if the student doesn't say that, those students don't sit in. And there's no discussion because we'd be violating the release of confidential records against a student's position.
Do you think that has to be a written permission? Like if I have a student with an A paper I want to share?
I don't think so myself.
Just a verbal?
If I got a verbal, but there's a big difference between that and a student saying, I'm up for ethical violations charges, and I've given permission. I'd like that in writing.
Yeah.
Well, wouldn't it also, I don't know, but wouldn't there be a difference if it was like something where they're exposing very personal information type of paper versus like some lit review research type paper, which doesn't expose personal things?
I think you should still ask.
You still have that.
Well, I'm not denying that. That's not my question. Oh. My question is that closer to being a violation? Maybe she should get it in writing because of the personal exposure.
I understand what you're saying.
Because person X is doing this quality work. That's the
the easiest way to deal with it, I think now that I think of it, because of the electronics, I usually send a student an email. And I say, your paper is one that would be great to share in class. Are you willing to share it? And they usually send me an answer back. And I save all the emails.
It's in writing.
Yeah, I save every email that I've exchanged with a student in class. Again, 40 years of teaching, I've had experiences where I didn't have those emails.
I do.
And later on, I said, well, oh boy, it didn't happen a lot. I don't want to frighten anybody. But when it does happen, it's awfully helpful to have the documentation on this. So what about self-disclosure of personal information by the faculty member? We talked about that.
Can we give an example of what you're talking about?
I had one that I was going to.
Yeah, okay.
I apologize for being late. I had a conference call that went really late, and I didn't want to totally miss this discussion. I have an example of when I personally disclose something. When I teach social work practice with, I had called it social work practice with youth. Here it's called something different. But we discuss sometimes how you might be working with an adolescent and some of your own issues might get triggered, and And one of the things that you might need to do as a social work practitioner is see someone, you know, in order to work out, you know, those issues that you're dealing with clients very cleanly and clearly and blah, 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 blah. And so I would say, just sort of matter-of-factly, you know, years ago, that happened for me when I was working with adolescent runaways and realized that some of my issues came up around having been physically abused as a kid. And then blah, 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 kept going and just mentioned that. To sort of, and I did that purposefully to normalize that for the students and to also, we had been talking about, I mean, I've had students get triggered around suicidality, for example, right in class. And so I did share that, and it felt very clear and fine that there was a parameter around it to me, but you might have a different view. You know, we never came back
let's
to it.
break it down. But break it
issue.
down, the two parts, okay? There's two parts what you just shared with us. And probably any of us could share something like that. Part one was, it's not unusual to have work with clients trigger, you know, traumatic experiences or memories, and for people having to go get some help.
Right.
I've experienced that myself working with adolescents. Part one. Part two, for example, having experienced abuse as a child, what's your reaction to part one and what's your reaction to part two? Is there a difference between part one and is there a difference between part two? Was that, I mean, we're trying to tease out criteria. Was part two necessary to make the point you were trying to make, or was part two going past the necessary to make the point? On the assumption that sharing data and information, including personal stuff, needs to be relevant, unavailable, and appropriate at that time. So if you break that down into two parts, what's your hunch? Part one, I think everybody in the room would raise their hand and say, that's very helpful for students to know that even faculty members, you know, have had that. Part two, was it necessary? You understand? What do you think? Was it necessary? And also, what does it do in the class if the faculty member makes that personal disclosure? You know, in terms of the boundaries for other people in the class, in terms of personal disclosure, which was the issue that we were struggling with.
I think that kind of opens up to students in class to start telling all their personal things if you say it in class. I don't think you said it in class, did you? You said it.
Oh yeah, no, that was in class.
It was in class.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh, because I think that. Okay, then.
Well, what I love about Marsha, she hides her reaction so beautifully.
I'm very open.
Sorry.
Is that self-disclosure?
Yeah.
It is. I'm self-disclosing. I'm very open. Okay. Anyway, I think what it does in that setting is, in fact, give the okay to students that they can share all of their things too, because you're modeling that behavior.
Well, it also sets up a thing of...
Which I think could be a problem.
It makes, for me, it would make me feel a little more vulnerable than I want to feel as a teacher.
To the class?
As a teacher, and maybe in the class.
See, and I never felt vulnerable, and students never disclosed personal information.
But ask yourself the question, was part two necessary
was
to
it
achieve
necessary?
purpose that part one achieved?
Yeah.
My hunch is it probably wasn't, you know? So then one would have to reflect as an instructor. Now, I think we do this all the time. I mean, I've had personal disclosure around, for example, work with clients. I was presenting my AIDS group as an example, and as part of telling the story, I reflected on one of the members who I felt close to. I felt close to all of them, but it was a transgendered member who brought all kinds of stuff, and she was the one I knew died. Now, I'll tell you right now, that was a personal disclosure in my class. And I still remembered the emotions. I didn't think about it. I wasn't trying to do it. I was just trying to give an example about that. In that case, I think that disclosure of personal emotions actually was helpful. That they could see the person who wrote their book still could have emotional feelings about a client that they had come close to, or really that the memory or thinking about that group or that client evoked some of those same experiences. We didn't go any further about that. I didn't talk about my own life experiences, but I talked about my professional experiences.
Sometimes I do something though to strongly make a point. You know, sometimes I do something to strongly make a point. Yeah. Well, the one point that I was thinking of though is usually my things are talking about social issues and racism and things like that. You know, so I was talking about racism, and I put some words up on the board that they wouldn't figure out where I was going right from the start with them, but one of them was permission. You know, permission. And I got the words all written down and had it in my mind how I was going to do this. And I said to the class, I said, I walked up to a person I knew who was dressed all in black. This woman was dressed all in black. And I said, hey, I'm Johnny Cash. And she said, get away from me, you faggot. You know? And I said, and that's the end of the story, you know? I said, what does that mean? You know, what does that mean? How come that could possibly be acceptable? How come I didn't get very angry at her? You know, how come, you know, in a lot of different situations. And, you know, and then I talked about we had permission. We're both the members of the same people group. And that happens a lot in similar people groups. I said, and then, you know, you get that across races sometimes, and I made a lot of various examples about the way that people that are of minority statuses have permissions to either be insulting or make mistakes. And then I went on to mistakes as a type of misrepresentation.
What was the course about?
It's research methods, but we were talking about social issues and adequate perception, and I had made the comment about Hurricane Katrina, and that I hadn't thought that it was so much of an issue about race as it was about an issue about poverty, and that was controversial in the class.
And the connection to the presentation you're making to research methods for that class. And I said the question I'm asking
for that particular
is it
class?
relevant to that class?
Well, what I brought it around to is how are we going to safely talk about issues of race and gender and
in this class?
In this class, yes.
That's kind
and
of
I said, you know, what do you do about people who don't have permission? Because almost everybody in this room really doesn't have permission to talk the way that you would talk if you were a member of that group. So how do we give each other permission to sometimes be wrong or not as careful as we could have been? You know, how do we talk about this comfortably and these issues comfortably? And I know that there was shock value in what I said. I meant it to be that way. And I'm not sure.
So are you raising this as a question, or are you just telling us?
No, I'm talking about personal disclosure, because it was personal disclosure. Well, what happens, I think, is after something like that is it's kind of like what Jim was saying, you know, where the class kind of divides around the issue. And it's like some people are pro what you did and some people are con what you did.
Let's for a moment. I just don't want to have the conversation go on about the teaching issues without recognizing something. We might have disagreement in the room about the appropriateness of people within a class using words like faggot, or adolescent black kids who will call each other niggers. There might be some disagreement right in the room around whether or not that's appropriate at any time, and what would a social worker's work with a population like that be if that became part of the conversation. Right. So I just want to acknowledge that the words themselves can be very painful and powerful. Am I making any sense on that? Yeah. And we probably could have a discussion about whether permission is really permission or permission is an internalization, you know, in fact, of a word that is hurtful.
Well, I'm very much paraphrasing everything, so I don't want it to get too
right, but I just don't want it to come out without some acknowledgement, at least my own view of that can be a problem. So I guess the question is, was it relevant at the moment? Was it the best kind of an example? Did the personal disclosure in that example make a major difference? Am I making sense? How does it connect to research? What's your thoughts? Could the same objective be accomplished without a personal disclosure? Do I want to use shock value in a class, and why? What is it that I'm doing in the class that requires shock value?
I think you ought to jump in. I think if Jennifer raises it, she's asking for us to give a response. That's my experience.
I think we should have a 3-credit course for all students on use of self in the field of social work. We used to have one of those when I graduated from this program, to understand who we are and what we are and how we say things. Not just teachers, students too, I think. Because it's a profession that you don't separate out real easily like you do when you stock shelves in the grocery store. Your job is part of who you are.
Just like certain programs that require their students to go for counseling for some extended period of time. It's like you don't want to stumble upon self-awareness solely through your field placement when you're working with borderline adolescent girls. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I have to go.
I'm wondering what that means as far as what I was saying.
Okay. We sort of shifted the topic a little bit as Bonnie was leaving. She sort of shifted a little bit off of Jennifer's, presentation, and that's what Jennifer's saying. Make a connection.
Right. Well, if in Jennifer's class, what she did was one mechanism towards that actually served the purpose of increasing self-awareness, increasing sense of self, things like that. Bonnie was talking about a class that would be more focused on something like that, so that these kind of things didn't keep coming up in class. And I agree.
Well, let's not lose the issue of the teaching question. The thing we set this discussion about was, when is it appropriate to do self-disclosure? When isn't it? When does an illustration or example from our own life enhance the teaching? When doesn't it? When does it cross the boundary? When does it not cross the boundary? And I think Jennifer shared an example, and she wanted to get it in. You almost didn't let you get yours in because you wanted to make sure we got it. She's genuinely asking us that reaction about that comment, that example. Okay.
I think the issue is context.
Talk to her. She's down there.
I think when you share something like that, it's not an isolated incident in class. And I think that we've had some other examples earlier. I think that there's a certain amount of shock value in terms of what you said. Well, if you're going to use that in class, I think that you also have to have other experiences which suggest that you're going to provide some security for students. So that both those things are there. And that if you take one piece of it without taking a look at what the whole context is, I think also the thing is that you shared that one piece, and I think that students will react to that depending upon how accessible they think you are in general. Is this a context of this is the only personal thing that you've ever shared in class versus there's been other personal things that you've shared in class? And I think that there's a contextual piece for it that either helps the students to feel safe and secure with that kind of discussion, or sets them off so they're not quite sure how to respond. And they may or may not address that with you. And so...
After
Go ahead.
Kelly,
No, I think that I agree, Jim. I think it's contextual. I also think it has to do with two different things. Like I heard two different things when both of you shared how you disclosed in class. I heard your disclosure more of this is what happened to me. I'm comfortable with it. This is something that will happen to you in treatment. Like I saw it as very the door closed. Like this is what it is and it's done. Whereas yours, Jennifer, I really saw you wanting to process it, almost like this was a concern of yours about race and wanting, like when you mentioned that, and how are people going to talk about it, and how, what words are we going to use, even talking about Hurricane Katrina in regards to the race issue. I felt like, as a student, I might have been like, where is she coming from on this? And it seems like she's wanting me to, share my own views and talk about race and really see where I'm coming from. So I felt like yours was more like this is a personal disclosure that is almost like I felt like it was a closed door kind of thing. Whereas yours, I thought you really opened it, and I can see where some students would feel like, okay, where are you coming from? You know what I mean? As a minority, I was like, wait a minute, what are you trying to say? What are you talking about? Because that's a sensitive topic. So I think in disclosure, I think it is also not only just about you sharing a person thing with you, it's whether or not you're expecting students to process that issue with you. If you're really almost again, we were talking about, having therapy sessions, and I'm not saying that that's what you were doing, but in a way, if you're kind of bringing it in so that it becomes an open forum of discussing your issue or disclosure, then I think that is where the line is drawn and that we shouldn't cross it in class. So, sorry to go on a huge pedestal, but that was my feeling.
I hear what you're saying, and it's useful. I guess, like the class finished up, and I got a lot of feedback from people that it was a wonderful class. It's only a very small amount of the class, that one statement, which was the kind of the pinnacle of the whole presentation, which took a while. The thing, though, is that sometimes I want people to pay attention. So many people, especially in social work, have heard the same statements many times, but they haven't heard them in a way that is strong. That's from within a disenfranchised culture. They don't. So many of the people don't know what it's like to be in the in with the crew down there, so to speak. And so I was using that.
Before you go any further, that would be a wonderful statement in a class by the instructor.
What's that?
What you just said to us? Mm-hmm. As an opening statement in a class, that you want this class to be meaningful, that so many people have heard these things over and over again, and it doesn't always have impact.
And we do.
That would be, I bet you it would accomplish exactly the same purpose.
We do.
You understand what I'm saying?
I think the division.
I had the same reaction, Jennifer, that it sounded more like a personal disclosure for Jennifer than a personal disclosure for the class. Yours sounded
Thank you, because
I
never keep finding the words.
You,
right.
But not really. It was really a personal disclosure for class, which you can have over again. You might leave part B out, with part A. The other thing I reacted to is if I'm a gay or lesbian student in the closet in the class, I might have a reaction to you using that word. I may not be part of the group that feels comfortable about that term. So I might be upset about that term being used in a class. Just as if it was a class we were talking about race and I was black, and the N-word, which is even in its utterance extremely painful, if that was used as an example, I might be upset about that, but not necessarily able to tell you because you've got a lot of authority. You're the teacher. So, we're not going to vote on this, all right? We won't resolve it. Yeah. But isn't it interesting that when we start to look at a single example, all kinds of criteria start to pop up about when is it helpful, when it is not helpful. Does it open students up to hearing? Does it close students up? I opened up as a student as I heard you telling us why you wanted to use that and why you felt the shock value was necessary. That part, I don't know. Anybody else feel it? That opened me up.
I did. I felt like, I can... And maybe that's the alignment, but I felt like, okay, she's got my back. As a minority, she is understanding that there might be some things or some, you're with me. But the first time I didn't really quite understand, and I was kind of like, and knowing you the way I know you, I'm like, wait a minute, you know this stuff. What do you, it didn't make sense. So I could see where there would have been wavering.
It's interesting that we so rarely, and we're going to end this because we're over time, but we so rarely share with students our concerns, the reasons why we want to try to get something. The way you spoke, I'm just sitting here thinking, gosh, if I was a student in that class, I would have felt a deep emotional commitment on the part of this teacher to try to convey things to me about what I need to learn as a student in terms of respect for and understanding of other populations.
Talk about role model.
That, I would have heard that, and you would have got my attention up. And we probably could have talked about what was it like in previous classes when you heard these things over and over again. Because you're absolutely right. After a while, students close down. But if we look at why they close down, I think that emotion and memory stuff that I mentioned earlier, I think that's related. They sit through oppression classes that they feel are oppressive, and instead of helping them open them, it shuts them down. And they don't hear. So the question I think Jennifer raised, the question you raised, is really a good one, which is how do I evaluate a personal disclosure? And it's one that every one of our students has to deal with when they work with clients. Somebody's grieving. Do I talk about my grandfather and understanding grieving? And when does it become my dealing with my grieving about my grandfather? And when is it a helpful disclosure about my life experience that might help this client deal with them? So this is not an end to this discussion. I have a feeling it's the beginning of the discussion. What do you think? And I think we ought to thank both of you, Diane and Jennifer, for sharing the examples. It just shows how much ambiguity and lack of clarity and lack of real good thinking about this issue is out there. Maybe we can sort it out somewhere. Jim, too, started us off on the very same issue. So let's go home.
Thank you.